Farther than I feared. Chapter 1. The radar never lies. The storm didn't ask permission. That was the thing Kendall Roarke had always appreciated about weather, its complete indifference to human scheduling. It didn't consult the calendar before it split the sky open over Flagstaff on a Tuesday afternoon in late May. It didn't consider that the Coconino County Fair was setting up tents in the meadow below Fort Tuthill, or that 3 separate hiking parties were somewhere above treeline on the San Francisco peaks, or that Nate Sellers had, for the 4th time this month, brought a turkey sandwich to work and left it in his car. The storm simply arrived, vast and unhurried and entirely sure of itself, and Kendall's radar told her everything she needed to know about what was coming. She had been watching the cell develop since 2 o'clock. What had started as a modest cluster of convective echoes over the peaks had organized itself into something serious over the course of 90 minutes, the kind of rapid intensification that made less experienced forecasters doubt their eyes. Kendall did not doubt her eyes. She leaned toward the primary display, where the return was painting itself in vivid oranges and reds, and felt the alertness the best storms always triggered in her. Not anxiety, but precision, the sharpening of everything. "Okay," she said to no one in particular. "There you are." The Flagstaff Forecast Office of the National Weather Service occupied a low, utilitarian building off of Beaver Street. Nothing about its exterior suggested that the people inside spent their days reading the atmosphere the way a surgeon reads a scan. Inside, it was all monitors and maps and the soft, continuous hum of systems processing data from 100 different sources. Doppler radar at the nearest site up on Anderson Mesa, surface observation stations across Coconino Plateau, radio sondes lofted twice daily from the upper air station to measure the temperature and wind at altitude. Kendall knew every instrument by its quirks and delays, the way a musician knows an instrument by its warmth or its tendency to go flat. She had been here 6 years. She knew what this sky was capable of. She drafted the severe thunderstorm warning for Coconino County with focused efficiency, her language precise and unpanicked, and pushed it out through the system at 3:47 p.m. Then she leaned back in her chair and watched the storm announce itself through the narrow windows above the workstations, the light outside going a particular shade of greenish-yellow that had no equivalent in any other natural phenomenon, the kind of light that made dogs restless and made Kendall want to stand in a field. "You know," Nate said from his adjacent workstation, not looking up from his own display, "most people see that color in the sky and experience something called dread." "Most people aren't paying attention," Kendall said. "You look like someone just brought you flowers." "I look like someone who correctly anticipated a rotating updraft developing over Humphreys Peak 4 hours before the first lightning strike, which is exactly what happened." She paused, "But thank you." Nate laughed, the short, resigned laugh of a man who had worked alongside Kendall Roarke for 3 years and had made a complete peace with the fact that she was better at this than him and that she genuinely loved every moment of it. He was a good forecaster. She was something else. She'd been recruited out of Oklahoma City, where she'd spent 4 years reading supercells on the Southern Plains, and when she'd driven up I-17 for the first time and seen the San Francisco peaks rising above the high plateau like a promise. Humphreys at 12,633 feet, the highest point in Arizona, still wearing a thin collar of snow even in April. She had pulled over on the shoulder of the interstate for no reason she could easily explain and just looked. She hadn't expected to love Flagstaff. She'd expected to be competent there, which was what she was in most places. But the city had gotten into her in some way she hadn't accounted for. The smell of ponderosa pine in the rain, which was something like vanilla, and something like a forest, and something entirely its own. The way the sky felt closer, at 7,000 feet elevation, as though the atmosphere were a room with a lower ceiling, the way the light fell through the aspens on the mountain in the fall. She'd stopped looking for reasons to transfer back east within the first year. She'd bought a couch. That was how she knew she was staying. Outside, the first serious crack of thunder arrived, the kind that doesn't build, but simply detonates, rattling the windows in their frames. Through a break in the cloud, she could see the dark silhouette of Humphrey's Peak against the churning sky, the peak itself already swallowed in cloud. The storm was moving northeast now, tracking right where she'd said it would, which was satisfying in the quiet, impersonal way being right about weather always was. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was more like confirmation, the feeling of the world being coherent, explicable, operating according to its own deep logic. She had spent her adult life finding comfort in that logic. It was an easier kind of faith, she sometimes thought, than the other kind. She had a Wednesday evening Bible study and a Sunday morning pew and a study Bible with her notes in the margins going back to college, and she believed, genuinely, not as a matter of habit, in the God who was the author of all of it, including the storm currently announcing itself over Coconino County. She just found it considerably easier to trace his hand in fluid dynamics than in the quieter, more personal territories of her own life, where the data was murkier and the variables less cooperative. She prayed every morning, briefly, tidily. And then she got on with what she was good at. She was aware this was not the whole picture. She was not sure what to do about that. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her keyboard, the buzz of a call, not a text. She picked it up and saw the name on the screen. Derek. The storm was still intensifying. She had a secondary cell to watch developing to the southwest. She would call him back in an hour when things settled. She set the phone face down on the desk and turned back to the radar. The cell to the southwest was doing something interesting. Chapter 2. Ordinances of Heaven. She called him back the next morning. That small fact, the 14 hours between Derek's call and her returning it, would stay with Kendall for a long time afterward. Not as guilt exactly, though guilt would visit too, more as a marker, a before. The last morning she drove up Route 89A with the windows down and her coffee going warm in the cup holder and nothing in particular pressing on her chest. The ponderosa pines filing past in their unhurried hundreds on either side of the road, the air coming through the window cool and resinous and clean, the way Flagstaff air always was in the early morning before the day heated up. She had his name in her phone's recent calls, and she pressed it without rehearsing what she was going to say, because she and Derek had never needed to rehearse. That was the whole foundation of it. 35 years of a relationship built on the reliable fact that she didn't have to arrange herself before talking to him. He picked up on the second ring. "There she is," he said. "I was starting to think you'd been carried off by one of your storms." Severe thunderstorm warning, Coconino County. It was a busy afternoon. She heard the smile in her own voice, the way she always did when she heard his. "How are you?" A pause. Not long, but Derek's pauses were a language she was fluent in, and this one said, "Here it is." "So," he said, "I have some news." Route 89 curved north toward the base of the peaks, the road climbing gently through the forest, the aspen groves beginning to show themselves between the pines, their leaves catching the early light and turning it silver. Kendall drove without thinking about driving, the way you do when a voice has taken up all available attention. Derek told her. He didn't ease into it. He never had, and she had always been grateful for that. The way he understood that prolonged approach only made the landing harder. The tremor in his right hand that had started last winter, which he had told her about then, and which they had both agreed was probably nothing. The appointment he'd finally made in February after it hadn't gone away. The specialist in Tucson. The additional testing. The name the specialist had given it at the appointment 3 days ago. Early-onset Parkinson's disease, 42 years old. I know, he said into the silence she hadn't meant to leave. It's a lot. Derek, before you go into meteorologist mode and start researching everything ever published about it, and I know that's exactly what you're about to do, I want you to know that I'm okay. Right now, today, I am okay. He paused. Also, I finally have an excuse to quit golf, which I've hated for 15 years and only played because Rosenthal at work guilts everyone into it, so there's that. She didn't laugh. She wanted to. She understood it was the gift he was offering her, the familiar key he was sliding under the door. But she couldn't find the lever for it. She had pulled over. She hadn't made a decision to pull over. The car had simply stopped, the way it sometimes did when the body understood something before the mind caught up, and she was on the shoulder of the road with the engine running and the pines on both sides of her and the peaks somewhere above the tree line ahead. Kendall. His voice changed, the comedy set aside. Just Derek now, the real one. You still with me? I'm here, she said. I'm right here. He was 10 years older than her. Most people, when they heard that, assumed a distance. Different generations, different reference points, the gap too wide for real closeness. What they didn't account for was what a decade of age difference looks like when a father leaves and the oldest child steps into the space left behind without being asked. Derek had driven her to every science fair from 4th grade through high school. He had been in the front row. She could still see the exact expression on his face, proud and slightly overwhelmed, when she walked across the stage to receive her meteorology degree. When she'd gotten the position in Flagstaff and called him from the parking lot after her interview, he had said, "Obviously you got it. I don't know why you're acting surprised." There was no version of her adult life that didn't have his voice somewhere in the background of it, steady and wry and completely convinced she was capable of more than she thought. He was the one person in the world with whom she had never, not once, pretended to be fine when she wasn't. She sat with the engine running for a while after they hung up. She'd told him she loved him. He'd told her not to look up mortality statistics. She'd said she absolutely was going to look up mortality statistics. He'd said, "I know, I'm already resigned to the paragraph-long text." She'd almost laughed that time. Now she stared through the windshield at the trees. She thought of a verse she had always loved with both parts of herself, the professional and the personal, which didn't happen as often as she would have liked. The psalmist writing that God makes lightning for the rain, that he brings the wind out from his storehouses, that the whole weather-making machinery of the sky is in his hands. She had found that verse early in her career and held it close ever since, evidence that the God of Scripture and the God of fluid dynamics were the same God, that her work and her faith were not separate rooms, but the same room. She had always found that quietly thrilling. Today, sitting on the shoulder of 89A with Derek's voice still in her ear, the verse arrived and then simply stood there, beautiful and inert. She could see the mechanism of a storm. She could name every process by which the atmosphere generated lightning and wind, and the particular greenish light that came before the worst cells. She understood the storehouses. She could not see inside this. She drove home. She made herself a second cup of coffee she didn't drink. She opened her Bible to the Psalms and read for a few minutes and then tried to pray. Tried the way she always did, which was to say, organized and intentional, beginning with gratitude and moving through the list. She got through 2 minutes, maybe less. The words felt like objects she was handing to an empty room, and she didn't know whether that said something about God or something about her, and she was too tired to work out which. She closed the Bible. She didn't reopen it. Outside her apartment window, above the roofline, the San Francisco peaks stood against the morning sky exactly as they always had. Patient, enormous, indifferent to what any individual morning contained. A single cloud trailed from Humphreys Peak like a loose thread and then dissolved in the upper wind. Kendall watched it go. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up the search bar. She typed, "Early onset. Parkinson's disease prognosis." She had told him she would. She was nothing if not reliable. Chapter 3. What Priya Said. Highlands Community Church met in a converted mid-century building on LaRue Street that had been, in previous lives, a dental office, and before that, a small insurance agency, and before that, something nobody currently remembered. Whatever it had good bones. Wide windows, hardwood floors worn soft by decades of foot traffic, a ceiling high enough to breathe in. The congregation had done the rest. Mismatched chairs arranged in a loose semicircle rather than rows. A low platform up front that looked more like a living room corner than a stage. And above the entryway door, painted in uneven hand-lettered strokes on a piece of reclaimed wood, the words, "Come as you are. Leave changed." Kendall had walked under those words every Wednesday and Sunday for 6 years and still looked up at them, sometimes without meaning to. She hadn't told anyone about Derek. It had been 4 days. She had researched Parkinson's disease with the systematic thoroughness that was her primary love language, filling a notes document with progression timelines and medication protocols and the names of specialists in Tucson and Phoenix. She had called Derek twice, brief calls, both of them, warm and carefully managed, neither of them saying the full weight of what they were carrying. She had gone to work. She had issued 2 advisories and 1 watch, and had a brief, collegial disagreement with Nate about a pressure system moving in from the Pacific. She had been, by every external measure, completely fine. She slid into the chair beside Priya at 6:58, 2 minutes before Pastor Glenn started, which was the exact margin Priya had come to expect from her. Priya was a labor and delivery nurse, and the most practically tender-hearted person Kendall had ever known, a combination that shouldn't have worked as well as it did. She had dark eyes that missed nothing, and the patience of someone who spent her working hours in rooms where people were simultaneously terrified and hopeful. She and Kendall had become close in the uncomplicated way that sometimes happens in small churches. Proximity and shared meals and Wednesday evenings in mismatched chairs until you looked up one day and realized this person knew you. She looked at Kendall now the way she sometimes looked at patients. Kendall kept her eyes on the front. Pastor Glenn Whitfield opened with a passage from Isaiah, and he read it the way he did most things, without performance, as though the words were furniture he was asking you to notice, rather than a display he was staging for you. He was a compact, deliberate man in his mid-50s, with a face that had clearly smiled a great deal over a long period of time, and his sermons felt less like arguments to be won and more like conversations you had been halfway through for a while. Kendall usually found that steadying. Tonight the words moved past her without landing. Priya waited exactly 4 minutes into the closing prayer time. She would later deny that she counted, but she had absolutely counted. And then leaned close and said, barely above a whisper, "What happened?" Not "Are you okay?" Not "You seem quiet." Just, "What happened?" Because Priya knew her well enough to skip the preliminary round. Kendall told her in a low voice, with her eyes forward, the prayer still going around them. The way you tell things in churches sometimes, the surroundings making it possible to say what you couldn't say elsewhere. Priya listened without moving. When Kendall finished, Priya reached over and took her hand in both of hers and held it, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Long enough to be useful. Then she said, "You need the retreat." Kendall started to answer. Priya's grip tightened slightly, not hard, just informative. Up front, Pastor Glenn had shifted from the closing prayer into an announcement he'd mentioned the previous Sunday, which Kendall had apparently filed away without absorbing. He was describing a weekend retreat that the church was doing for the second year in partnership with a wilderness chaplain named Seth Hargrove, who ran a backcountry spiritual program based out of the San Francisco Peaks. Small group, no phone service past the first mile, a trail camp at around 10,000 feet elevation. Glenn smiled in the mild way. He smiled when he was about to say something he meant. "For those of you who find it easier to pray when you're walking than when you're sitting," he said, "this one is specifically for you." Kendall had never thought of herself as someone who prayed better walking. She had always assumed, a sitting person, an organized, indoor, annotated margins person. She was watching Glenn, and so she didn't see Priya pull out her phone and navigate to the sign-up form. She only became aware of it when Priya reached over and said quietly, "What's your dietary restriction again? Just the walnuts?" "Priya?" "Got it. I'll just leave that blank." "I haven't agreed to—" "You're down for the June retreat." Priya pressed submit with the calm efficiency of someone who had made many decisions in high-pressure environments. "I'm coming with you. We leave the 14th. Kendall looked at her. Priya met the look with an expression of complete serenity. At the door on the way out, Carol Whitfield intercepted them. Glenn's wife, a woman who showed up with a casserole and said exactly the right thing, and who had the gift of making whoever she was talking to feel like the only person in a room. She said something light and kind to Priya, and then she turned to Kendall, and her expression shifted slightly, not into concern exactly, but into attention. She reached out and squeezed Kendall's arm, just once. "I'm praying for you this week," she said. "Specifically. Not generally. Not I'll keep you in my prayers the way people sometimes said it as a pleasantry. Specifically." Kendall managed a smile and a thank you, and made it to the parking lot before she had to stop walking and take a breath. She sat in her car for a moment with the windows down. The Flagstaff evening was cool, the way it always was even in late May, the ponderosa forest at the edges of the city, breathing in the dark. She picked up her phone and, without entirely deciding to, opened a browser and typed in the name from Glenn's announcement. Seth Hargrove, Peaks Wilderness Ministries. The website was spare, undesigned in a way that felt intentional rather than neglected. A few photographs of trails and open sky, a short description of the retreat programs, a contact form. His bio was 4 sentences: former Army chaplain, ordained minister, Flagstaff native. I believe God speaks in wild places. There was one photograph of him, on a ridge somewhere on the peaks, the valley spread below and the sky enormous above, his back partly to the camera, looking out at whatever was in front of him. She couldn't make out much. He looked like someone who was comfortable being where he was. She wasn't sure she'd ever fully understood how that felt. She closed the tab and started the car and drove home through the dark pines. Chapter 4. Where were you? The trailhead parking lot at the base of the Humphreys Trail held, on most Saturday mornings in June, a particular kind of person. The serious hiker with trekking poles and a hydration system, the casual tourist who had underestimated the elevation and would figure that out approximately 20 minutes in. The occasional trail runner arriving in the gray pre-dawn like a person with a private argument to settle. At 6:30 in the morning, when Kendall pulled in and found a spot between Priya's Subaru and a dusty Forest Service truck, the lot was quiet and cold, and smelled powerfully of pine and something mineral that she associated with high altitude and early mornings, and the sense that the ordinary world had agreed to stay behind. She had packed correctly. She knew she had packed correctly because she had read 3 separate backcountry packing guides and cross-referenced them against the gear list Seth had emailed to Pastor Glenn, who had forwarded it to the group. Her pack was fitted to her frame. Her boots had been broken in. She had the right layers for the temperature drop above treeline and a rain shell for the afternoon storms that were nearly guaranteed in June. She was prepared in every measurable way. She was wearing, Priya informed her cheerfully while they waited, the expression of someone prepared to audit a retreat rather than attend one. "I don't know what that means," Kendall said. "You look like you're about to take notes." "I might take notes." "Kendall, for processing purposes, it's how I process." Priya opened her mouth to respond to this, but then the group's attention shifted. A collective, quiet realignment, the kind that happens when a room changes without anyone announcing it. Kendall turned. Seth Hargrove crossed the parking lot with a pack on his back and a calm about him that was not performed and not studied and not the careful ease of someone trying to appear relaxed. It was what he was. The way certain landscapes have authority without announcement, the San Francisco peaks being a reasonable example, present and enormous without requiring anyone's acknowledgement. He was tall, broad-shouldered without being heavy, with the kind of face that had spent considerable time outdoors and wore it honestly. His hair was dark with early gray at the temples. He moved like someone who had walked a great many miles and intended to walk a great many more. He greeted each person by name, working around the small circle, 6 church members plus Priya and Kendall, along with his co-leader Cal Merritt, a bearded older man with kind eyes who stood slightly apart and said very little and radiated the particular peace of someone who had stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. When Seth reached Kendall, he extended his hand and said, "Kendall Roarke, meteorologist with the National Weather Service. You probably know these mountains better than the rest of us on paper." "Radar coverage and precipitation modeling mostly," she said. "I haven't actually summited Humphreys." "We won't summit today, but you'll see country you haven't seen from a screen." He said it without edge, just as a fact, and moved on to the next person. She watched him go. The smile had been brief and entirely his own. It bothered her slightly that she'd noticed it as specifically as she had. The trail ascended through stands of ponderosa pine that gradually gave way to spruce and fir as the elevation climbed, the forest changing character the way a long conversation changes tone, gradually, then noticeably. The air thinned in a way that was perceptible, but not punishing at this pace. Seth setting a rhythm that was steady and sustainable, a pace that invited attention to the surroundings rather than demanding attention to the effort. Kendall had hiked enough in her years in Flagstaff to be comfortable, but she was aware that this was different from a day hike. Heavier pack, longer commitment, nowhere to turn around and be home in 20 minutes. The trail wound through an aspen grove, where the trees stood white and close together, their leaves catching the morning light and broadcasting it in small, brilliant pieces. Wildflowers threaded between the rocks along the path, Indian paintbrush in orange and red, the blue-purple of lupine, clusters of tiny white things she couldn't name. Cal was walking near the back of the group, talking quietly with 2 of the other church members. Seth moved between the front and middle of the line, checking in with people without hovering. Priya had fallen into comfortable conversation with a woman named Janet from the Wednesday Bible study. Kendall walked and tried to let the walking be enough. It was not yet enough. She was still carrying the weight she'd arrived with, which she'd half hoped the altitude might thin along with the air. It hadn't. Derek was in Tucson, probably making coffee right now, probably making a joke to himself about something, and his hand still shook with the particular tremor that had a name now, and she was here on a trail, which was either an act of faith or an act of avoidance, and she genuinely wasn't sure which. Camp was set in a clearing at roughly 10,000 feet, ringed by spruce and open to the south, where the land fell away toward the plateau, and you could see, on the far horizon, the faint line where the earth curved into the canyon country. The afternoon passed with the setting up of tents and a period of quiet that Seth called intentional rest, without making it feel like homework, and Kendall sat on a log at the edge of the clearing and looked south for a while and let her mind run itself out the way. A motor runs after you cut the ignition, ticking and settling until something quieter was underneath. The campfire that evening was built in a stone ring that had been used by previous groups, the wood already prepared. The group settled around it as the last light left the peaks above, and the temperature dropped with the abruptness that high elevation produces. The transition from day to night feeling less like a gradient than a decision. Kendall pulled her fleece tighter. The fire threw warm light across the faces around the circle. Priya, her eyes bright and already more relaxed than she'd been all week. Cal on the far side, still and attentive, Janet and the others finding their settle. Seth sat on a low camp stool across the fire. He didn't open a Bible. He didn't have notes. He looked at the fire for a moment first, as though consulting it, and then he looked up at the group. He paraphrased from Job 38 without introducing it formally. Just let the words arrive. God speaking to Job out of the whirlwind, asking him, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When the cornerstone was set and the morning stars sang together, where were you?" He let the silence hold for a moment after. Then he said, "I don't want to talk tonight about what that passage means theologically. You've probably heard that conversation. I want to ask a different question." He looked around the circle, unhurried. "What does it do to you? Not in your head, here." He touched his sternum briefly. "When God asks that question, where were you? What moves in you when you hear it?" The fire popped and resettled. Someone on the other side of the circle said, quietly, that it made her feel small. Another voice said it made him feel relieved somehow, though he wasn't sure why. Priya said it made her feel like she'd been trying to carry something she was never meant to carry. Kendall said nothing. She was looking at the fire and feeling the question move through her, the way a pressure wave moves. Not a sound you hear so much as a sensation you register in the chest. She had expected theology. She had her notes ready for theology. She was not prepared to be asked what something did to her, and the fact that she had an answer she wasn't saying anything about sat with her for the rest of the evening. The group began breaking for tents around 9:30. The fire was banked but not extinguished, still breathing orange at its center. The sky above the clearing was a thing that people who lived at lower elevations did not have access to, not as a matter of opinion, but as a matter of physics. At 10,000 feet, above the scattered light of Flagstaff below, the Milky Way was not a smear or a suggestion, but a structure, dense and detailed and present in a way that changed the quality of standing underneath it. Kendall had tilted her head back and stopped planning to go to her tent. "It recalibrates something," Seth said. She hadn't heard him come back. He had settled onto a nearby camp stool, a few feet away, a tin cup in both hands. Not encroaching, just present in the way he seemed to be most things, there without insisting on it. "The scale of it," she said, still looking up. "Job 38 keeps going," he said. "After the foundations of the earth, God asks about the Pleiades, whether Job could bind their cluster or loosen Orion's belt, whether he understood the ordinances of heaven." He paused. That passage is addressing a man who had correct theology. Job knew what God was supposed to be. He had the framework, and then his life came apart, and all of that framework. He stopped, tilting his cup slightly. It became like reading a weather report for a storm you're standing inside of. Kendall went very still. She kept her eyes on the stars for a moment. Then she said, and it was the most honest question she had asked out loud in 2 months, possibly longer. What do you do when that happens? Seth looked up at the Pleiades. She could see the angle of his face in the peripheral dark. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was answering truly, rather than reflexively. Mostly, he said, I go outside. She almost said something more. The shape of Derek's name was almost in her mouth. But the night was very large, and she wasn't ready, and somehow he seemed to understand that, because he didn't ask, and after a few more minutes, he said goodnight and left her with the stars. She lay in her sleeping bag later with the tent fabric dark above her, the mountain cold pressing in at every seam, and noticed, with the detached curiosity she brought to unusual data, that she was not agitated. The weight was still there. Derek was still in Tucson. The name on his chart hadn't changed, but something had shifted in the quality of carrying it, as though she'd been holding it at arm's length for 2 weeks and had finally, without deciding to, let it rest against her chest, where it was heavier and closer and somehow less consuming. She didn't have a word for that yet. She lay still and let it be wordless. And outside the tent, the mountain breathed around her, and above the mountain, the Pleiades held their ancient, unreachable cluster against the dark. Chapter 5. His Way in the Whirlwind. Seth's instruction for Sunday morning was the simplest one Kendall had ever been given and the hardest to follow. He dispersed the group across the upper meadow just after breakfast, pointing each person toward a different corner of the landscape. A boulder outcropping, the far edge of the tree line, a shallow rise overlooking the valley, and said only, pay attention to what you notice. Not what you think about what you notice, just what you notice. No timer, no journaling prompt, no structure beyond the instruction itself, which was the point, and which Kendall understood intellectually, while immediately and almost comically beginning to organize it into a structure in her mind. She found a flat-topped boulder near the tree line, its surface warmed already by the morning sun, and sat on it and put her hands on her knees and looked out. The meadow was alive in the way high-elevation meadows in June are alive, quietly, insistently, in 1,000 small registers at once. A Clark's nutcracker moved through the spruce at the meadow's edge with its harsh carrying call. The grass was still wet from the night and caught the light in long, horizontal lines. To the south, the plateau spread itself toward the horizon in shades of amber and green and the faded red of the canyon country beyond. The sky was the high-altitude blue that had no gray in it, the kind that made the world below feel like a secondary consideration. She tried to pray, not her usual morning arrangement of words, organized, sequential, appropriate. She tried something she didn't have a name for, which was closer to just holding Derek in front of God without agenda and seeing what happened. It was harder than it sounded. Her mind kept reaching for action items. She kept wanting to solve the prayer the way she solved a forecast, identify the variables, assess the probabilities, arrive at a recommendation. But the boulder was warm, and the meadow was quiet, and the sky was doing nothing except being enormous, and after a while, her mind ran out of places to redirect itself, and she sat in something that wasn't peace exactly, but was adjacent to it. A willingness to be still. She wasn't sure she'd ever let herself be this unproductive on purpose before. She didn't hear Seth approach so much as become aware that someone was sitting on the ground nearby, cross-legged in the grass, easy as always, as though he'd been there for some time. He had a way of arriving without disturbing things. She suspected it was a skill with specific origins. "How's the solitude treating you?" he asked. He didn't look at her when he said it, just out at the meadow. "I tried to alphabetize it," she said. "It didn't cooperate." He smiled at the middle distance. "That's progress, actually." They were quiet for a moment. A ground squirrel investigated the edge of her boot and then reconsidered. Down the slope, she could hear the faint, distant voices of the rest of the group, dispersed and muffled by distance and wind. "My brother was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's 3 weeks ago," she said. "He's 42. She hadn't planned to say it. The altitude produced this, she thought, or the boulder, or the 2 minutes of something adjacent to prayer, or simply the fact that Seth Hargrove had a quality of attention that made evasion feel more effortful than honesty. He turned toward her then, fully. Not with alarm or the rapid recalibration of someone shifting into a professional mode, just with attention that gathered itself and held. She told him the shape of it. The phone call on Route 89A, pulling over among the pines, the joke Derek had made about golf that she'd failed to laugh at. The way she'd come home and opened her laptop before she'd even taken her coat off. She told him about the 2-minute prayers and the Bible she'd closed, and the feeling of having every framework she'd carefully constructed suddenly standing at the wrong angle to the thing she was actually facing. Seth listened without interrupting, without nodding emphatically, without doing anything except being completely present in the way that was rarer than people understood. When she finished, he didn't speak immediately. He picked up a small stone from the ground beside him and turned it over in his fingers. "That's the kind of thing that breaks the frameworks," he said. "Does it stop being terrifying?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think it changes character," he said. "The terrifying part becomes less like a wall and more like—" He paused. "More like weather, actually. Something you can be inside of without being destroyed by it." She looked at him. His expression opened. An acknowledgement. He had served as an Army chaplain for 8 years, he told her. 2 deployments. He had sat with men who were dying in places that had no reason to be as beautiful as they sometimes were, and with men who were afraid they were going to survive and have to carry what they'd seen. He had prayed over things he had no adequate prayers for. What he'd understood, somewhere in the accumulated weight of those years, was that his faith was not a system that processed hard things and produced peace. It was a relationship with a person who was present in the hard things, which was different, and the difference mattered completely. "The thing that changed me," he said, "wasn't a sermon or a passage or anything someone said to me." He set the stone down. "It was a night outside a forward operating base in Afghanistan. I stepped out because I needed air, and I looked up, and there were the same stars I grew up watching from the peaks." He was quiet for a moment. Same stars. Different ground. And I understood something I couldn't have explained to anyone, that the universe was held. Not fixed, not controlled like a system, held, like something in a hand. Kendall was quiet for a long moment. Then, almost to herself, she said the verse she had always carried from her professional life. Nahum 1:3, paraphrased, "His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet." "I've always loved that verse," she said, "because it's meteorologically defensible." Seth laughed. A real one, sudden and surprised out of him, bright in the morning air. It startled her into something that was almost a smile. "I love that you said that," he said. And then, more quietly, looking at her with a directness that was not unkind, "Maybe it's time to let it be personally defensible too." She didn't answer. But she didn't look away either, which was its own kind of answer. They walked back toward camp together along the ridge trail, which followed the shoulder of the mountain southward and offered, through breaks in the spruce, long views down the slope and across the plateau below. The afternoon was building the way June afternoons in northern Arizona reliably build, cumulus towers developing to the south and east, white at their tops and darkening at their bases as the instability increased with the day's heat. Kendall read the sky as she always did, automatically, the visual data sorting itself into analysis before she could choose otherwise. That cell to the southeast was developing a strong updraft. The one further west was outrunning its moisture supply and would likely dissipate before it became anything serious. She stopped walking. Seth stopped a step later and turned. Below them, the high plateau of the Colorado stretched itself toward the horizon in that enormous, quiet way it had, the ponderosa forest threading across it in dark green patterns, the geometry of Flagstaff faint and distant on the plain. And moving across the desert to the south, slow and inevitable and beautiful in the way that only large weather systems seen from above are beautiful, a curtain of rain. A full Virga shaft descending from a cumulonimbus base, blue-gray and translucent, dragging its veil across the canyon country. From this distance and this height, she could see its shape entire, beginning and middle and trailing edge, the way you could never see a storm when you were inside one. She knew its type, its structure, its probable rainfall rate. She knew exactly what it was. For a moment, she let herself just see it. It was extraordinary. Seth stood beside her without speaking. And that was the thing. That quality of standing beside without filling the space, without remarking on it, without doing anything except being present to the same thing she was present to. The wind on the ridge moved through the spruce around them, and the storm moved across the desert below them, and neither of them said a word for almost a full minute. And Kendall understood, standing there, that this was its own kind of language. That some people could be quiet beside you in a way that felt like company rather than absence. She had not known that she was missing that. She became aware, at some point, that she was not looking at the storm anymore. She looked back at the view and said nothing, and Seth said nothing, and after another moment, they continued down the trail toward camp. That evening at dinner, across the camp stove and the circle of easy conversation that the second day of a retreat produces, the group loosened now, the strangeness worn off. Priya caught Kendall's eye, just once. A look of precisely calibrated meaning that said several things simultaneously without using any words at all. Kendall looked deliberately at her tin plate. She was aware that this did not constitute a convincing denial. Chapter 6. After the mountain. The hike down on Sunday afternoon was quieter than the hike up had been, not subdued, but settled. The way a room is quiet after a long and good conversation. The group moved through the spruce and fir and back down into the ponderosa, with the easy, reluctant pace of people not yet ready to return to the world, waiting at the bottom of the trail, but who understood that it was waiting nonetheless. Kendall walked near the middle of the line and let the forest do what it had been doing all weekend, holding her in its enormous, indifferent, somehow personal way, and tried not to think about what Monday looked like. The parking lot arrived sooner than she wanted. Packs came off and car trunks opened and the small rituals of departure began. The group gathered in a loose cluster for a closing prayer from Cal, brief and genuine, the kind of prayer that didn't announce itself as beautiful but was, and then broke into the comfortable, unhurried goodbyes of people who had spent a night on a mountain together and were changed by it in ways they hadn't finished understanding yet. Janet had exchanged numbers with Priya. 2 of the other men had already made plans to do the Kachina Trail the following month. The retreat had done what retreats, at their best, are supposed to do. Not solved anything, but opened something. Seth moved through the goodbyes with the same careful attention he brought to everything, a word for each person, a handshake, something specific rather than general. Kendall watched him without watching him, or tried to, which amounted to the same thing. When he reached her, he shook her hand the way he had the first morning. His grip was straightforward and brief. "Thank you for the weekend," she said. It was... She searched for the word and couldn't find one sufficient. "It was good." "It was," he agreed, and then, quietly enough that it was only for her, not staged, not performed, just said, "I hope you let yourself go outside when it gets hard." She understood that he meant literally and otherwise simultaneously. "I'll think about it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know you will." Then Cal said something from across the lot, and Seth turned, and Kendall turned too, toward Priya's Subaru, and put her pack in the back and got in and closed the door. They were 4 minutes down the road before Priya said anything. "He noticed you." Kendall kept her eyes on the road ahead, the familiar descent through the ponderosa forest, the afternoon light coming through the trees in long, angled columns. "I don't know what that means." "Yes, you do. We had a conversation on the trail about faith and..." "Kendall." Priya's voice was not unkind. "I have watched that man interact with every person on that retreat for 2.5 days. I know what his regular attention looks like." A pause. "I know what the other kind looks like, too." Kendall said nothing. Priya, to her credit, let it rest there. The week after the retreat had a different texture than the weeks before it, though Kendall would have been hard-pressed to name exactly what had changed. She called Derek every day. Brief calls, easy in the way their calls were always easy on the surface and full of more underneath, and she went to work and read the atmosphere and issued her advisories and had a perfectly ordinary disagreement with Nate about orographic lift that she won decisively. She went to Wednesday Bible study and sat beside Priya and paid attention to the things Glenn said in a way that felt more porous than usual, as though something that had been sealed had been opened slightly at the edges. Her prayers were different. Not transformed. She wasn't going to overstate it, but longer and less arranged. Less like correspondence and more like sitting in a room with someone she was slowly becoming less formal with. She found herself, more than once, simply saying Derek's name and then not following it with anything, just leaving it there, and finding that the leaving it there was not emptiness, but something else she didn't yet have language for. On Wednesday evening after Bible study, she drove past her apartment without turning in and continued up the road to Buffalo Park, the open recreation area on the north side of Flagstaff, a wide mesa of open grassland ringed by ponderosa forest with an unobstructed view of the peaks rising above the north end of the park, Humphreys and Agassiz and Fremont standing in their ancient arrangement against the evening sky. She walked the perimeter trail as the light went out of the day, the peaks darkening from their daytime gray-blue into something more purple and then into simple silhouette, and she prayed while she walked, not organizing it, not sequencing it, just talking into the open air the way you talk when you've stopped trying to be impressive. It was not elegant. It was considerably better than what she'd been doing before. She did this again on Friday. And then again the following Tuesday. She didn't decide to make it a practice. It became one, the way things do when they fit against a need you hadn't known how to name. She was walking the park perimeter on a Thursday evening, the peaks going gold in the late light above the north end of the trail, when her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She pulled it out, expecting Nate. There was a system developing to the west that they'd been keeping an eye on, and saw instead a number she didn't recognize. She opened the message. Kendall, it's Seth Hargrove. Pastor Glenn passed along your contact at my request. I hope that's all right. There's a talk I'm giving at the library next Friday evening about weather patterns and the theology of the natural world. It might be interesting given your work and your particular way of talking about that Nahum verse. No pressure at all. Seth. She stopped walking. She read it again. Then a third time, though by the second she had already absorbed every word, and the third was not about information. At my request. She looked up at the peaks. They were doing what they always did, standing there, enormous and patient, the same as they had been before she'd read the message, and the same as they would be after, entirely unconcerned with the fact that something had just shifted in the quality of her Thursday evening. She put the phone back in her pocket and continued walking. She would think about this in an organized and reasonable way when she got home. She was already composing her reply before she reached the next bend in the trail. Chapter 7. No pressure. The Flagstaff City Library on East Aspen Avenue was what a mid-sized mountain town gets right when it's paying attention. Warm-lit and easy, with good shelving and comfortable chairs and a community room in the back that hosted, on any given month, a rotating cast of local authors, amateur astronomers, hiking clubs, and the occasional spirited debate about water rights. On a Friday evening in late June, it held approximately 40 people arranged in folding chairs, a modest podium at the front, and a projection screen displaying a photograph of the San Francisco peaks taken from somewhere above the cloud line, the peaks themselves rising into clear sky, while the valley below was entirely submerged in white. Kendall took a seat near the back. She had explained her reason for attending to Priya in person, and Priya had listened with the expression she reserved for statements she found unconvincing, patient, warm, and completely unpersuaded. When Kendall had followed up by text to add a clarifying point, Priya had responded with a single emoji that Kendall declined to interpret. The meteorological content of a talk titled Faith and the Natural World. Reading the sky as sacred text was relevant to her work, or adjacent to it, or at minimum worth a Friday evening to evaluate. This was a reasonable position. Seth arrived at the podium without preamble, the way he arrived at most things, and the room settled without being asked. He was in a dark flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearm, and he looked the same as he had on the mountain, present, not arranging himself for the occasion. He thanked the library briefly, and then looked out at the room and said, "I want to start with a question. How many of you have stood outside during a storm and felt something you couldn't explain?" Most of the hands went up. "Good," he said. "That's where we're starting." He was a good speaker. Kendall had expected this, but found herself attentive anyway, in the way she was attentive when something was being done well. He moved between meteorological observation and theological reflection, with a naturalness that didn't feel forced, the way certain high-pressure systems produce crystalline visibility, the way storm systems in the Hebrew Scriptures are almost always sites of encounter, the way Elijah found God not in the earthquake or the fire, but in the sound of a low whisper on the mountain afterward. He spoke about the Psalms and atmospheric rivers in the same breath, and it didn't feel incongruous. His meteorological content was, to her measured irritation, accurate. Not just directionally accurate, specifically accurate. He understood the behavior of convective systems over the peaks. He knew what orographic lift was, and used the term correctly. When he put up a radar image of a classic monsoon supercell over the Mogollon Rim and described what was happening dynamically inside it, she found herself making a small mental note, correct, and then found herself annoyed at the noting, because it meant she had arrived prepared to find errors and hadn't found them, which was not the neutral professional stance she'd assigned herself. She stayed in her seat afterward while the room thinned. She had not planned to stay. She had planned to go home and consider the talk in private and perhaps send a brief, collegial message about 1 or 2 points of interest. That was the plan she had walked in with, and it lasted until Seth looked up from a conversation with an older man near the podium, found her across the emptying room, and lifted one hand in a simple acknowledgement. Not beckoning, just noticing. She walked to the front. "Your pressure gradient explanation was accurate," she said when he'd finished with the other man. "High praise," he said. "I was worried about that part." "You should have been. Most people get it wrong." She paused. "You didn't." He smiled, brief and entirely his own. "Can I ask what you thought about the Elijah section?" "I'm never certain whether that reading holds up to people who think hard about what weather actually is." "I thought it held up." He looked at her as though that mattered to him specifically. They drifted toward the water pitchers in the back of the room, and somewhere in the drifting, the conversation changed character, became less evaluation and more exchange, 2 people discovering the shape of each other's thinking on ground that belonged to both of them. She told him about the Perseids, how she drove out to the mesa east of town every August for the peak of the meteor shower, how the light pollution dropped off sharply past the edge of the city, and the sky opened up in a way that always recalibrated something in her, regardless of how many times she'd seen it. He said he'd done the same thing. The same mesa, he was almost certain. The pullout past the cattle guard on the forest road. And there had been a year when the Perseids peaked on a moonless night, and he'd lain on the hood of his truck for 2 hours and lost track of what he'd been worried about before he drove out there. "Same night, different years," she said. "Same sky," he said. She disagreed with him about the Kachina Trail, specifically about whether the west approach or the east approach offered better views in the morning light, a disagreement she held on solid observational grounds. He held his position with the calm particularity of someone who had walked that trail in every season and wasn't going to be argued out of his experience of it. She respected the holding of the position. She didn't concede it, but she respected it. He asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. It was direct and uncomplicated, the same way he was direct and uncomplicated, and she said yes before she had finished deciding to, heard the word leave her mouth, and recognized that it was the honest answer, even if it wasn't the organized one. "Sunday morning's probably not ideal," he said, with the slight smile of someone who knew what Sunday mornings were. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday." Fire Creek Coffee occupied a warm, narrow space a few blocks from downtown, a local coffee shop that had earned its regulars by being consistently excellent rather than aggressively atmospheric. Good light, good music at a considerate volume, the smell of dark roast, and something baked that greeted you at the door like a personal welcome. Kendall arrived 4 minutes early and ordered before she sat down, which was a habit she'd had since graduate school and had never examined. Seth arrived on time with the ease of someone who was always on time, without making a project of it, ordered a black coffee at the counter, and settled into the chair across from her. They talked for 90 minutes. She asked about the Army, and he answered in the specific, unlayered way of someone who had processed his history sufficiently to inhabit it rather than manage it. 2 deployments, 8 years total. He'd been ordained before he enlisted, had felt called to chaplaincy specifically, to the ministry of being present with people in circumstances that exceeded the reach of ordinary comfort. He'd come home to Flagstaff a decade ago because, he said, the peaks pulled him back in a way he'd stopped trying to rationalize. "I got tired of looking for God in places that didn't have mountains," he said, and she couldn't tell, for a moment, whether he was being wry or entirely serious, and then decided it was both. She told him about Oklahoma City, the 4 years on the Southern Plains reading supercells, the particular violence and beauty of tornado season on the prairie, the way the sky there was so enormous and unobstructed that weather felt like a direct conversation. She told him about the first time she'd driven into Flagstaff and pulled over on I-17 to look at the peaks and hadn't been able to explain to herself why. And he leaned forward slightly when she said that. The lean of someone hearing something that maps onto their own experience. "I did the same thing," he said. "Coming back from Fort Lewis. I'd been gone 4 years, and I came around that last curve on I-17 and saw them, and I pulled over and sat there for 10 minutes. "What were you feeling?" He considered this. Like I'd been speaking a foreign language for 4 years and had just heard my native one. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Something about the image stayed with her. The idea of a landscape as a native language. She had never put words to what Flagstaff was to her, exactly, but that wasn't far off. They disagreed about the Kachina Trail again, with more specificity this time, both of them now deploying actual trail data to support their positions. It went unresolved, and neither of them seemed to mind. She was recounting a particularly dramatic pressure gradient event from the previous winter when she became aware that someone had approached their table. She looked up. Carol Whitfield stood there in her light jacket, with a to-go cup in one hand, and the expression of someone who had just discovered something delightful and was exercising considerable restraint about it. She greeted them both with warmth and the practiced social grace of a pastor's wife who had decades of experience entering and departing conversations without disrupting them. She said something light about the weather, which landed with a particular humor at a table occupied by a meteorologist, and then touched Kendall's shoulder briefly on her way to the door. She turned back once. Her eyes went to Seth and then to Kendall, and she said, quietly enough that it was only for Kendall, "He's good people." Then she was gone. Seth raised an eyebrow. "Carol," Kendall said, as though that explained everything. "Does she do that often?" "She has a gift for saying the right thing at the right moment and then removing herself before it becomes awkward." Kendall picked up her cup. "I've been the recipient of it before. It's disarming." "Is it true, though?" he said. His tone was light, but he was watching her. She met his eyes. "I think it probably is," she said. She called Carol that evening. She hadn't planned to. She'd driven home from Fire Creek, with the late afternoon light falling gold across the peaks, and the comfortable, slightly disorienting feeling of having been genuinely known by a conversation, and she'd sat in her apartment for 20 minutes before she picked up the phone. She'd meant to call Derek. She would call Derek. But first she sat and let herself consider the fact that something ordinary had happened today. Coffee, 90 minutes, a disagreement about trail access, and that it had felt like considerably more than ordinary, and that this was its own kind of terrifying. She called Carol because Carol had a gift for calibrating these things without making them either smaller or larger than they were. Carol answered on the second ring and said, "I wondered if you might call." Kendall laughed, which was the relief she'd needed. She talked, and Carol listened, and somewhere in it, the conversation shifted from Seth Hargrove to Derek, the way conversations with Carol sometimes migrated toward their true destination. She told her about the research, the daily calls, the way she kept her worry organized in a separate mental folder she opened at intervals and tried not to carry constantly. The way the worry kept escaping the folder. The mental calculation she couldn't stop running. Where was he in the progression? What did the next 2 years look like? What did 5 years look like? What were the signs she should watch for? Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the gentle and direct way that was entirely hers, "The Bible says to let tomorrow worry about itself, that today has enough trouble of its own, without borrowing what hasn't arrived yet. You don't have to carry what hasn't happened, honey." You really don't. Kendall sat with that. She knew the verse. She had it in her Bible, in its proper location with a note in the margin from a study years ago. She knew its context, its original language, its place in the Sermon on the Mount. She had read it many times with the part of her that read and cataloged. It was different to hear it said to her, specifically, on a Friday evening, by a woman who meant it. "I know," she said. And then, "I'm working on believing it." "That's all it takes," Carol said. "The working on it." She called Derek after she hung up. He was in good spirits, or performing good spirits, and she could no longer always tell which was its own quiet grief. He asked about her week, and she told him about the library talk, carefully neutral, and he said, "A wilderness chaplain. That's a real job?" "Apparently. Huh." A pause, the comfortable exploratory pause that meant he was deciding whether to pursue something. "Is he interesting?" "He knows his orographic lift," she said. Derek laughed. It was a real one. She knew all of his laughs. "High praise from you." They talked a while longer. Before they hung up, he said, "Hey, I have something I want to ask you when you visit next month. Nothing urgent, just..." He paused again. "Something I want to do in person." "Okay," she said. "Okay." His voice was warm and careful both. "Good night, Ken." She set the phone down on the coffee table and looked at the ceiling. She knew what the question probably was. She had known, somewhere below the level of organized thought, since the day he was diagnosed. It was the question that only had one right answer, and the right answer required her to step fully into the most unforecastable territory she had ever been asked to enter. She lay very still and felt the shape of it, this thing that was coming, this necessary, terrifying, loving thing. And outside her window, the Flagstaff night was quiet, and the peaks stood in their darkness above the city, and tomorrow was not here yet. She let it not be here yet. It was, she thought, a start. Chapter 8. The Weight of a Name on a Form. She left Flagstaff at 7 in the morning on a Saturday in mid-July. I-17 South was quiet at that hour, the high plateau still in the long shadow of the peaks, the ponderosa forest thinning gradually as the elevation dropped and the landscape made its slow, declarative transition from mountain to desert. Kendall had made this drive enough times to know its stages by heart. The forest giving way to juniper and scrub oak around Munns Park, the land opening into the wide valley at Camp Verde, where the Verde River cut its green thread through the brown, and then the long climb up the other side, and the descent into the Valley of the Sun, where the saguaro cactus began appearing at the roadsides like a welcoming committee, their arms raised in that gesture that looked, depending on the day, either like celebration or surrender. She had her coffee. She had the playlist Derek had made her 2 Christmases ago, which she put on now because it felt right. His taste running to classic rock and the occasional left-field jazz selection that she'd always teased him about. She had, in the passenger seat, a travel thermos of Fire Creek's dark roast, packed carefully in her bag that morning, because Derek deserved the best coffee she had access to, and she intended to deliver it. She had not told him she knew what the question was. She had carried that knowledge for 3 weeks now, carried it the way she'd learned, haltingly, to carry most things lately. Not locked in a separate folder, not managed at arm's length, but present, resting against her, heavier and closer and somehow less consuming than the thing she kept at a distance. Carol's words had worked on her in the slow way that true things work. Not immediately, not as a switch thrown, but as a gradual reorientation, like a forecast model that updates with each new data point until the picture becomes something you can actually use. She still worried forward sometimes. She caught herself doing it and came back. That was the whole practice. She was beginning to understand. Not the elimination of the reaching ahead, but the returning from it, again and again, as many times as it took. Tucson arrived the way it always did, suddenly and then entirely, the desert city spreading itself across the wide Sonoran Basin with the unapologetic sprawl of a place that had grown fast and built outward. But there was beauty in it too, if you knew where to look. The Santa Catalina Mountains rising above the north end of the city, the saguaro forests in the foothills, the quality of light that the desert produced in the morning and the evening that had no equivalent anywhere she'd been. Derek had moved here 12 years ago for work and had never left, which she had understood gradually over time. The desert got into people the way mountains got into people, differently, but just as completely. His apartment complex was quiet on a Saturday morning, the small courtyard shaded by a Palo Verde tree in full yellow bloom. She buzzed his unit, and he answered the intercom with, "Please tell me, that's Fire Creek." "It's Fire Creek," she said. The door clicked open. He looked good. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it with the relief of someone who had spent 3 weeks constructing mental images, calibrated to the worst available data. He looked like Derek, a little thinner maybe, but Derek had always been lean. The same easy posture, the same slight ironic lift to one eyebrow when he opened the door and saw her expression. "You're doing the assessment thing," he said. "I'm not." "You looked at me the way you look at a radar return." "I'm just glad to see you," she said, and hugged him and meant it completely. His apartment was organized in the way that was entirely Derek. Not sparse, but deliberate, everything in a considered place. Bookshelves arranged by subject and then alphabetically within subject, which was a tendency he'd had since childhood, and which she had always found both admirable and slightly alarming. On the kitchen counter, his coffee maker was already running. She set her thermos beside it, and he looked at it the way people look at thoughtful gestures when they're trying not to be moved by them. "You drove 4 hours with coffee," he said. 2 hours, 50 minutes, and yes. He poured 2 cups, hers from the thermos, his from his own pot, because he had his loyalties. And they took them out to the small patio that faced a stand of saguaro on the slope behind the complex. A hummingbird appeared at the feeder he kept on the patio railing, hovered in its impossible way for a moment, and departed. The morning was already warm, with the dry, clean warmth of the Sonoran Desert before the day's full heat arrived. They talked about nothing important for 20 minutes. This was not avoidance. It was practice, the long-established ritual of 2 people who had always understood that the weight-bearing conversations went better when they were preceded by lighter ones. They talked about his colleague Rosenthal, who had apparently moved on from guilting people into golf and was now guilting them into a fantasy football league. They talked about the new coffee place that had opened near his office. She told him about the pressure system she'd been tracking all week. He told her about the book he was reading, A History of the American Southwest, which he was cross-referencing with an older one from the 90s for comparison because Derek had never read 1 book on a subject when he could read 3. His right hand was on the arm of his patio chair. She noticed it once, deliberately, and then let herself not track it. He set his coffee down after a while and looked out at the saguaro, and she knew by the quality of the pause that the 20 minutes were over. "I've been putting some things in order," he said. Not dramatically, just tidily, while it's easy to do it tidily. He glanced at her. "You understand that impulse?" "I do," she said. He reached to the small table beside him and picked up a folder, manila, labeled in his precise handwriting, the kind of folder that meant he had thought about this for a long time before she arrived. He held it for a moment before he set it on the table between them. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it before I need to. while we can talk about it like two reasonable people and not in a moment when everything is already hard. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced it being steady. I want you to be my medical proxy. He said it plainly, the way he said most things. Not building to it, not softening the approach. If there comes a time when I can't make decisions for myself, I want you making them. You think clearly when everything's on fire. You don't flinch from hard information. And you know me well enough to make the call I would make. He paused. You're the person I trust with this, Kendall. You're the only one. She looked at the folder on the table between them. She looked at her brother's face. The face that had been in her earliest memories, the face that had been in the front row at her graduation. The face that was looking at her now with the careful honesty of someone who was frightened and refusing to let the fear make him less than direct. Yes, she said. It came out evenly, which surprised her. She had expected the word to cost more on the way out. Derek nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone releasing something they'd been holding. I wasn't sure if you'd... Yes, she said again, more simply. Of course, yes. There was never going to be another answer. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup, and she saw his hand. The right one, the one with the tremor, steady itself against the ceramic, and she looked at the saguaro on the hillside and let him have the privacy of the moment. They signed the documents inside at the kitchen table. A neighbor called in as a witness. A retired schoolteacher named Bev from down the hall, whom Derek had apparently briefed, because she arrived with the calm efficiency of someone who knew her role and executed it without drama. The forms were precise and clinical in the language that legal documents use, full of conditionals and defined terms, and Kendall read every line before she signed it because she was constitutionally incapable of signing a document she hadn't fully read, and Derek watched her do it with the look she recognized as his version of deep affection. Bev witnessed the signatures and left, and Derek made a fresh pot of coffee, and they sat back down. Thank you, he said. Don't, she said. I'm going to anyway. I know. I'm preemptively objecting. He smiled. It was a real one, full, unguarded, and she kept it. She left at 2 p.m, the desert heat by then arriving in earnest, the thermometer on her dashboard reading 104 as she pulled out of the complex. The drive north retraced everything the morning had given her. The Sonoran Plain, the Verde Valley, the rising elevation pulling the temperature down degree by degree, the juniper returning, and then the ponderosa, the sky deepening from the pale, washed-out blue of the desert to the saturated high-altitude blue she had come to think of as simply home. She was north of Cordy's Junction, the landscape rising toward the plateau, when the thing she had been holding together began, quietly, to come apart. Not catastrophically. Not with drama. Just the folder in the back seat, and Derek's hand steadying against the coffee cup, and the word proxy and everything it meant. Landing in her fully, now that she was alone, in a way they hadn't in the apartment. She took the next exit and pulled into a rest area. Picnic tables and a concrete building and a water fountain, the highway noise behind her, and the desert scrub spreading out in every direction, and got out of the car and stood in the wind. The wind was significant. A dry, warm flow from the southwest, 20 miles an hour sustained, kicking dust from the flats and moving the scrub brush in long, rippling waves. She stood in it and let it move against her and thought about what she had agreed to today. She knew the medical landscape. She had researched it thoroughly in those first raw weeks. The progression timelines, the decision points, the terminology of proxies and directives, and the clinical weight of the authority she had just accepted. She knew the information completely. The information was not the thing. The thing was this. Derek had asked her to be present in his worst moments, to stand when the time came in the most unforecastable weather she would ever face, not to predict the outcome, not to analyze the variables and arrive at a probability, to simply be there and to love him well enough to make the call he would make in a moment when everything she knew how to do would not be enough. She had spent her entire professional life reading the atmosphere from a careful, skilled distance. Behind glass, behind screens, behind the elegant remove of data and modeling, and the professional calm she wore as naturally as her own skin. She was good at it. She was genuinely, rigorously good at it. And none of it, not one instrument, not one data set, not one framework she had built her competence on, reached into the territory she had just agreed to enter. She stood in the desert wind for a long time. She tried to pray and found that she had no words arranged, nothing sequential or organized, no beginning or end. She opened her mouth, and what came was not language, but something beneath language, something that was mostly just Derek's name and the folder in the back seat, and the particular way he'd nodded when she said yes. She got back in the car. She reached into her bag and pulled out her Bible. She'd brought it without thinking that morning, the same way she brought her phone, by habit and by need, and set it in her lap. She didn't look for a passage. She just let it fall open, the way her grandmother used to do, a practice Kendall had always regarded as insufficiently rigorous. It opened to Job. Chapter 38. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? She read it in the wind noise of the rest stop, the dust moving past the windows, the highway behind her full of people going north and south with their ordinary Saturday purposes. She read it not looking for a lesson, not taking notes, not finding the connective tissue between the passage and her doctrine. Just reading, just looking at the page. It was the same question Seth had opened the campfire with 7 weeks ago on the mountain. The same question that had moved through her like a pressure wave. She sat with it now and let it be, for the first time, not theological. She texted Seth. She typed it before she could edit it into something more composed. I think I need to go outside. She sat in the rest stop and waited. His reply came in 4 minutes. Tuesday morning, I know a trail. I'll pick you up at 7. She set the phone on the seat beside her and looked through the windshield at the Sonoran scrub and the enormous pale sky and the dust moving in the wind that the book of Nahum said was the dust of his feet, and she breathed. Then she started the car and drove north toward the mountains. Chapter 9. Nothing can separate. He picked her up at 7 exactly. She had been ready since 6:45, which she acknowledged to herself as data without dwelling on it. The morning was cool and bright, the Flagstaff summer doing what it did best in the early hours before the day's heat gathered. The air clean and carrying the smell of pine and the freshness that came after the previous afternoon's monsoon shower. The street still faintly dark at the gutters where the runoff had moved through. She came out the front door of her building as his truck pulled up, a dark green pickup with the kind of honest road wear that meant it was used for actual things, and he leaned across and pushed the passenger door open from the inside. "How was the drive back from Tucson?" he said when she'd settled in. "Long," she said. "Good. Both." He nodded and pulled away from the curb without asking anything further, which was exactly right, and she looked out the window at the morning streets and let herself be driven somewhere for the first time in longer than she could account for. The Kachina Trail began on the south slope of the peaks at a trailhead off the Snowbowl Road, winding eastward through mixed conifer forest at around 9,000 feet, lower than the retreat camp, more sheltered, the trees here closer together, and the light coming through them in long, filtered columns that moved with the morning wind. It was a Tuesday, and the lot held only 2 other cars. The trail was quiet in the way that weekday trails in summer are quiet. The weekend hikers gone, the serious ones already hours ahead, the mountain mostly given back to itself. Seth had said, "Walk first, talk when it's ready." So they walked. The trail moved through stands of aspen that were just beginning at the edges of their leaves to show the first faint whisper of the yellow that would overtake them entirely by September. Spruce and fir grew between them, dark and dense and smelling of resin. The path was soft underfoot with accumulated duff, years of fallen needles composting themselves into something that gave slightly beneath each step, and the sound of walking on it was almost no sound at all. Just the wind in the canopy above, and somewhere, intermittently, the knocking of a woodpecker working a dead spruce. Kendall walked and let the walking be enough. It was enough more quickly than she expected. The mountain did something to the quality of time, compressed the urgent, expanded the present, and by the end of the first mile, she could feel the rest stop at Corda's Junction, loosening its grip on her, not releasing entirely, but becoming one thing among several, rather than the only thing. The folder in her back seat had been replaced by a signed original in Derek's filing cabinet, her name on the relevant line in his precise handwriting, witnessed and notarized. It was real. It was done. She had done the right thing, and she knew she had done the right thing, and the fear of it had not disappeared but had changed. As Seth had once suggested, fear could change, from wall to weather, something she was inside of but not destroyed by. She thought about that as she walked, and about the question that had been sitting quietly at the edge of her thinking since she'd texted him from the rest stop. What it meant that he was the person she'd reached for. Not Priya, who was her closest friend, not Carol, who had become a kind of anchor. Seth, who had known her for less than 2 months, who had met her in a parking lot at the base of a trail with a pack on his back and said something about radar coverage that had bothered her slightly and stayed with her considerably. She knew what it meant. She was 35 years old, and she had been precise and organized and intellectually honest about most things in her life. For long enough that she could be honest about this too, when the moment was right. The moment was not yet right. She kept walking. 40 minutes in, the trail opened briefly onto a rocky outcropping where the trees fell back and the view extended south across the plateau, a broad, clear lookout, a bench of flat stone facing the valley. Seth stopped. She stopped beside him. They were breathing from the pace and the altitude, and they stood for a moment, just breathing, looking out. Then she talked. She told him everything in the order it had happened, pulling up to Derek's complex with the Fire Creek thermos, the Palo Verde in the courtyard, the 20 minutes of comfortable nothing before the folder appeared on the table between them. She told him about the documents and Bev the retired school teacher and Derek's precise handwriting on the label, and about her brother's face when she said yes before he'd finished asking, and the way his hand steadied against the coffee cup, and she'd looked away to give him the privacy of the moment. She told him about Corda's Junction and the wind, and standing in the desert scrub, feeling the full weight of what she'd agreed to, and opening her Bible without looking for anything and landing on Job 38, and sitting there with the question, "Where were you?" and letting it be, for the first time, something other than a theological proposition. She told him she was afraid. Not the managed, categorized version of afraid that she'd been carrying in her organized mental folder. The real one, the one that lived below the research and the preparation and the competence. The fear that when the time came, she would not be enough. That the love she had for her brother was real and large, and would still somehow be insufficient to the moment. That she had said yes to something she could not forecast, could not model, could not read from a safe and skilled distance. That all the things she was good at would stand at the edge of that territory and stop. Seth listened the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, without the pastoral lean-in that would have made it feel like a counseling session rather than a conversation between two people on a trail. He was sitting on the rock beside her now, forearms on his knees, looking at the valley below. When she finished, the silence ran for a moment. Not empty, but full, the way silences are when someone is genuinely considering rather than preparing their response. "Can I tell you what I actually hear in that?" he said. "Yes. I hear someone who loves her brother so much that the responsibility of it is terrifying." He paused. "That's not a deficit, Kendall. That's the love doing its job. The love is supposed to be bigger than you can manage. That's what makes it love, and not logistics." She sat with that. "I've spent my whole life understanding God from the outside," she said. It came out plainly, without self-pity, just as an observation she had arrived at and was now handing over. "I have the notes. I have the references. I know the frameworks. And when I actually needed to be inside the faith, inside the trust, inside the surrender, I didn't know how to get there. 2-minute prayers and a closed Bible." She looked at the plateau below, the high, flat land stretching south toward the canyon country. "I'm not sure I know how to get there even now. I just know I need to." Seth was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What you just described is not a crisis of faith." She looked at him. "It is faith," he said. "The studied version, the notes, the frameworks, the references, that's the map. Good maps are worth having. But what you're doing right now, on this trail, in that rest stop in the desert, that's the territory." He looked at her steadily. "You've been in the territory all summer. You just kept calling it by the wrong name." Something in her chest eased. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the significant movement of something that has been braced against a weight and finds the weight suddenly redistributed. She breathed it in. "There's a passage," he said after a moment. He wasn't reaching for his phone or a Bible. He had it the way he had most things. Inside him, accessible, lived in rather than looked up. Paul writes in Romans that nothing, not death, not life, not angels, not anything in the present or the future, not any power, not anything in all of creation, has the ability to separate us from the love of God. He said it quietly, not preaching, not performing, just offering it the way you hand someone something they need. Nothing. Not a diagnosis, not a medical proxy form, not being afraid of the territory, not the distance between the map and where you're actually standing. He paused. Not 2-minute prayers, not a closed Bible, not any of it. She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the aspens below the outcropping. That aspen sound, the collective trembling of 1,000 small leaves, like a vast and gentle applause for nothing in particular. "I've read that passage 100 times, she said. "I know. It's different when someone says it to you." "I know that too," he said. They sat on the outcropping for a while longer without talking, and it was the comfortable, inhabited silence of people who had said the important things and didn't need to fill the space left by them. Below, the plateau spread itself toward the horizon in its ancient, indifferent beauty, the ponderosa forest and the high grassland and, far to the south, the beginning of the great unraveling of the earth that was the canyon country. The Colorado Plateau, pulling itself apart over millennia into something that stopped conversation. And building above that southern horizon, slowly, with the deliberate, cumulative architecture of the monsoon season, a cumulonimbus, still distant, still developing, its top spreading into the characteristic anvil shape as it hit the upper atmospheric boundary, white and enormous against the deep blue sky. Kendall saw it the way she always saw weather, automatically, professionally, the visual data sorting itself before she chose to sort it. Convective development, strong updraft, probable hail in the core, forward motion east-northeast at maybe 20 knots. She knew exactly what it was. She looked at Seth instead. He was looking at the same cloud, and there was something in his expression, the openness of it, the uncomplicated attention, that was so different from the careful, managed way she had looked at most things for most of her adult life that she felt it as a contrast. A comparison she hadn't made consciously, but that was suddenly, quietly obvious. He turned from the cloud and found her looking at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She said, "I don't know what I would have done with this summer without—" She stopped. The sentence had started somewhere true and arrived somewhere she hadn't fully prepared. She looked back at the cloud. "Without what the retreat did," she finished. It was imprecise, and she knew it was imprecise, and she suspected he knew it too. He was quiet for a moment. "I know what I would have done without it," he said. She waited. "I would have missed you." He said it simply. No elaboration, no cushioning, no rhetorical architecture around it. Just the statement, plain and specific, offered with the same directness he brought to everything. "I would have gone on leading retreats and giving library talks and walking these trails, and I would have been fine, and I would have missed you without knowing what I was missing." He paused. "I'm glad I know." The aspen leaves moved in the wind below them. She looked at him, fully, without the sideways quality she'd been deploying for 2 months, the peripheral attention she'd given herself permission for while withholding the direct kind. She looked at him the way she looked at things she was trying to understand completely, and what she found was simply this. This person, on this rock, on this mountain, in this summer that had broken her frameworks and rebuilt something truer in their place. "I'm glad you know," she said. It wasn't everything she might have said. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. The right-sized word for the right-sized moment, neither of them requiring more than what was true. They turned back toward the trailhead after a while, the morning having deepened into mid-morning, the light shifting from its early slant to something more direct. The trail wound back through the aspens and the spruce, descending gently, the mountain releasing them back toward the ordinary world with its usual undemonstrative generosity. They walked side by side where the trail was wide enough, somewhere on the lower section of the trail. She couldn't have identified the exact moment which seemed right. His hand found hers. Not reached for, exactly. Found the way you find something you've been looking for without having admitted you were looking. His hand was warm and unhurried, the same as everything else about him, and she didn't pull away, and neither of them mentioned it, and the trees moved around them in the mountain wind, and they walked the rest of the way to the trailhead in the kind of quiet that had nothing left to prove. They sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after they'd stowed their packs, not ready yet for the drive back into town, the radio, the ordinary forward motion of the day. Through the windshield, the peaks rose above the tree line, Humphreys and Agassiz, and the long ridge between them, the same as they had been this morning and the morning before, and every morning of the 6 years she'd lived beneath them. "I've been thinking about Derek," she said. "About what I agreed to." She looked at the mountains. "I said yes in his apartment because it was the right answer, and I knew it was the right answer. But I signed those papers still holding the fear at arm's length, still treating it like something to manage rather than something to walk into." She paused. "I think I'm ready to actually carry it now. Not manage it, carry it." She looked at him. "That's different for me." "I know it is," he said. And then he started the truck, and they drove back down the mountain into the summer morning, and the sky above Flagstaff was doing what it always did. Building, shifting, enormous and uncontainable and entirely extravagantly alive. Chapter 10. Farther than I feared. 3 weeks later, the monsoon season came to Flagstaff in earnest. It arrived the way it always did, not gradually but decisively, the atmospheric pattern shifting in early July as the winds turned and began pulling moisture up from the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of California, feeding the afternoon convection that built over the mountains and plateaus of the Southwest with a reliable, magnificent intensity. By mid-July, the pattern was fully established. Clear mornings, building cumulus by noon, dramatic afternoon storms rolling through by 3 or 4 o'clock, the smell of rain on hot pavement and wet pine needles filling the city in the evenings like something poured from a great height. The arroyos ran. The wildflowers along the roadsides went extravagant. The peaks disappeared into cloud most afternoons and emerged each morning clean and dark against a washed sky. Kendall loved monsoon season with a devotion that was both professional and personal, and this year she loved it with something additional she didn't try to name too precisely: a quality of presence, an attentiveness to the actual texture of each day that was new enough that she still noticed it as new. She was in the territory now. She was trying to stay there. She drove back to Tucson on a Saturday morning in early August. The saguaro on the hillside, behind Derek's complex, were doing what saguaro did in the monsoon, absorbing water through their shallow root systems and expanding visibly, their pleated trunks smoothing as they filled, storing what the desert gave them against the long, dry seasons that would follow. She had always found that quietly instructive, and today found it more so. Derek opened the door before she knocked. "I could hear you on the stairs," he said. "You walk like a meteorologist." "I don't know what that means." "Purposeful," he said. "Like you know where the weather is." She hugged him in the doorway, and he hugged her back with both arms, his chin briefly on the top of her head, the way he'd done since she was 12 years old, and she let herself stay there a moment longer than she usually did. He had made coffee, his own from his own pot, his loyalties intact, and they took their cups to the patio where the morning was still reasonable before the day's full heat arrived. The hummingbird came twice to the feeder on the railing. A cactus wren announced itself from somewhere in the saguaro on the slope with its long, complicated call. "Tell me about the wilderness, chaplain," Derek said. She had mentioned Seth once, briefly, carefully, in the neutral tone she'd deployed before she'd acknowledged to herself that neutral was no longer accurate. Derek had let it pass that time. Derek never let things pass twice. She told him. Not everything. Not the outcropping on the Kachina Trail, or the hand on the lower path, or the quality of the parking lot afterward. But the real shape of it. The retreat and the campfire and the library talk and Fire Creek and the Tuesday morning on the mountain when she'd said the things she hadn't said to anyone else, and he had offered Romans 8 without making it feel like a prescription. Derek listened with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered to him, his coffee cup resting on the arm of his chair. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the considering way. "He pushes back on you?" he said. "On the Kachina Trail approach, yes. Regularly." "Good." Derek nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone delivering a considered verdict. "You needed someone who could keep up with you." "He doesn't always agree with me." "Even better." He looked at her with the expression she recognized as his version of deep satisfaction, the elder brother look, the one that said he had been waiting a long time for something and was pleased to see it arrive. Is he a good man? She thought of the campfire and the stars, and "I would have missed you," said, without architecture or cushioning. "Yes," she said. "He is." Derek picked up his coffee cup. His right hand was steadier this morning than it had been last time, which she noted and filed without building projections on it. One day. This day. The practice. "Good," he said again, more quietly. And then, "Dad would have liked him, I think." It was the kind of thing Derek said occasionally. Not often, never manipulatively, just when it was true, and when the truth of it seemed worth saying. Their father had been gone from their lives so long that he existed now mostly as an outline, a shape, defined by his absence. But Derek had known him in ways she hadn't, had been old enough to carry memories she didn't have, and sometimes he offered them to her like this, small, specific, unexpectedly warm. She looked at the saguaro on the hillside. "Yeah," she said. "Maybe." They sat with that for a moment, the desert morning easy around them, the hummingbird making its third appearance at the feeder with the dedicated purposefulness of a creature that knew exactly what it needed and where to find it. Back in Flagstaff the following week, the monsoon was delivering. A particularly strong cell had developed over the peaks by 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, a classic pulse-severe storm, feeding on the instability that the monsoon moisture and the afternoon heating produced in magnificent combination. Kendall was at her workstation when it went severe, issuing the warning for Coconino County with the focused efficiency that never got old. The radar painting the storm in vivid returns that told her everything she needed to know about what was happening inside it. Nate had his concerned face on. Nate's concerned face had become something of a personal benchmark. "That's a serious rotation signature," he said. "It's not rotation," she said. "It's a strong rear flank gust. Watch the motion vector. It's going to shear apart in the next 20 minutes. "How are you this calm?" "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm paying attention. Those aren't the same thing." Nate looked at her. "You've changed this summer," he said. "I can't figure out how, exactly." "The storm is going to shear apart in 20 minutes, she said. "Pay attention." It sheared apart in 17 minutes. She did not make a point of this. She was between watches, the main cell having moved northeast toward the Navajo Nation, and a secondary cell still organizing to the southwest, when her phone buzzed on the desk. Seth. He was on a trail above town. She could picture the elevation, the south-facing slope, the view from there on a day like this. She stepped into the break room to take the call. "I can see your storm from up here," he said by way of greeting. "Tell me what you see." "Enormous. Moving northeast. The anvil is fully spread. It looks like something from the Old Testament." "Cumulonimbus incus," she said. The anvil shape forms when the updraft hits the tropopause and spreads laterally. The ice crystals in the upper cloud get blown downwind. What you're seeing is the top of an updraft that was probably going 90 miles an hour 10 minutes ago. A pause. "You sound like you're talking about something holy," he said. She looked out the break room window at the trailing edge of the storm, the dark base moving away to the northeast, the sky behind it already brightening toward the deep monsoon blue that followed the cells as they moved through. "Maybe I am," she said. And she meant it, both the meteorology and the other thing, the thing beneath it, the belief she had carried all her professional life, that the God of Scripture and the God of fluid dynamics were the same God, and that understanding one was a way of knowing the other. She had always believed it. She was only now learning to inhabit it. "I'll call you after the shift," she said. "I'll be here," he said. She went back to her workstation. The secondary cell to the southwest was doing something interesting. She leaned toward the display and felt the familiar sharpening of everything, the precision that the best weather always triggered in her. And underneath it, steady and unhurried, Something that had not been there a year ago. Something that didn't require the data to be complete before it could hold. Sunday morning at Highlands Community Church arrived under a sky that had been washed clean by Friday's storms, the blue above the peaks so saturated and clear that it seemed less like atmosphere than like intention. Kendall drove to LaRue Street with her windows down, the air cool and carrying pine, and pulled into the familiar lot with the familiar feeling, amplified this morning, warmer, of coming to a place that knew her. Seth was already in the third row. He had started attending Highlands the first Sunday in August, not at her suggestion, not at Pastor Glenn's, but his own. His previous church in town had dissolved when the pastor relocated, he'd explained, and he had been meaning to find a congregation and hadn't. And the combination of Glenn and the retreat partnership and certain other factors he named with a slight smile had made Highlands the obvious answer. Priya had received this information with the restraint of someone heroically suppressing an "I told you," so that she had technically never said out loud. Kendall slid into the pew beside him. He handed her a bulletin without looking up from his own. She took it, and their fingers overlapped briefly on the paper, and neither of them made anything of it, which was its own kind of making something of it. Carol Whitfield, 2 rows ahead, did not turn around. Her shoulders, however, suggested she was smiling. Pastor Glenn rose and greeted the congregation with the easy warmth that was entirely his own, not performed, not adjusted for the occasion. Just Glenn, the same as he was every week, reliable in the way that good things are reliable. He opened his Bible and said he wanted to spend the morning in a passage from Job, the 38th chapter, the voice from the Whirlwind. Kendall went still. Glenn read it the way he read most things. Like furniture he was asking you to notice, like a conversation already in progress. He read God's questions to Job. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you entered into the springs of the sea? Can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades or loosen the belt of Orion? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? He read them in his steady way, one after another, and let each one land before the next arrived. Then he set the Bible down on the pulpit and looked at the congregation. The answer, of course, he said, is nowhere. We were nowhere when the foundations were laid. We don't hold the Pleiades. We don't govern the ordinances of heaven. He paused. And somehow, this is the thing I want you to sit with this morning. That is not meant to make us feel small. It is not a rebuke dressed up as a question. He looked out at the room. It's meant to make us feel held. There is a God who was there when the foundations were laid, who does hold what we cannot hold, who governs what we cannot govern, and that God, that same God, calls us by name. Another pause. You were not there at the beginning. You don't have to be. You are here now, and you are known, and you are held. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when something true has been said simply. Kendall looked down at her bulletin. Her pen was in her hand. She hadn't remembered taking it out. She wrote one word in the margin, small and certain. Territory. She felt Seth shift beside her. She knew without looking that he had seen it. The slight change in the quality of his stillness that meant he was present to something specific. She kept her eyes forward. His thumb came to rest over the word. Briefly, gently, a quiet pressure there and then lifted. A period at the end of a sentence, an amen without sound. The congregation filed out into the August morning in the easy, unhurried way of people who were not yet ready to leave each other. The Flagstaff summer was doing what it did in early August, warm and brilliant in the mornings, before the afternoon clouds built. The light falling through the ponderosa at the edge of the parking lot at an angle that made everything it touched look considered. Glenn stood at the door, shaking hands, and Carol moved through the dispersing congregation like someone who knew exactly where she was needed and when. Kendall stood on the front steps, with Seth beside her, and looked up. Above the city, above the parking lot and the hand-lettered sign and the ordinary Saturday sounds of Flagstaff going about its business, the San Francisco peaks rose against the morning sky in their ancient, patient arrangement. Humphreys at the apex, then Agassiz, then the long southern ridge, carrying the eye down toward the plateau. A single line of cumulus was building along the crest, white and clean, the first suggestion of the afternoon convection that would develop by 2 o'clock into something magnificent. She knew what it was. She could name every process by which it would grow. The heating of the slopes, the rising thermals, the moisture from last night's storms still available in the lower atmosphere, all of it feeding the cumulus that would become cumulonimbus, that would become the late afternoon storm that she would read from her workstation tomorrow and the day after, and the day after that. The sky doing what the sky did, reliably and extraordinarily, above this city she had not expected to love and had loved completely. She knew all of it. She looked up anyway, not reading the sky today, not sorting the data, not reaching for the forecast, just watching. Just here, in this morning, under this sky, with the cumulus building above the peaks, and Seth beside her and Derek's voice on the phone last night, laughing about something she'd already half forgotten, and the word territory still faintly indented in the margin of the bulletin folded in her hand. The clouds moved. She watched them go. Somewhere behind her, Carol Whitfield said something that made Priya laugh, that clear, genuine laugh that carried across a parking lot. And Pastor Glenn's voice was warm in the doorway, and the ponderosa forest breathed at the edges of everything, and the sky above Flagstaff was doing what it always did, building, shifting, speaking in the language she had spent her life learning to read. She was still learning. She thought she might be learning for a long time yet. That was all right. That was, in fact, exactly right. Thank you for spending some time with us, listening, reflecting, and resting in God's endless love. If this story touched you, encouraged you, or brought a moment of peace, I'd be so grateful if you'd leave a like. It helps our uplifting stories reach more hearts. If you'd like to join us for more grace-filled tales, please subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until we meet again in the next story, may you carry His grace with you, one gentle step at a time. Simply Grace Audio. Simple stories, endless grace.